There is a figure Jung kept returning to throughout his entire career, not the shadow, not the self, not even the archetype of the hero. The figure that troubled him most, the one he wrote about with the most caution and the most reverence, was the Anima, the soul image, the inner feminine carried inside the psyche of men. Jung described her as an autonomous inner figure, always present at the threshold of what the conscious mind could reach, and always slightly beyond it. He said she could elevate a man to his highest perceptions. He also said she was the single most misunderstood force in the human mind. What Jung never fully named, what the psychological tradition never quite said aloud, is this: some people do not just encounter the Anima, they carry her. They are built to translate between her world and ours. This is not ancient history. This is your story. There is a kind of person who has always been here. They go by different names in different centuries: the cunning woman, the hermit, the witness, the seer, the exile. The world has tried more than once to be rid of them. The world has never managed it. If you carry one of these patterns, you already know. Today, the Anima, the oldest force in Jungian psychology, and the one the Sigma INFJ has been carrying without knowing its name perhaps your entire life. Carl Jung first encountered what he would later call the Anima through his own crisis. From 1913, during the period he documented in the Red Book, Jung descended into a deliberate confrontation with the unconscious. He wrote of encountering inner figures who seemed to exist independently of his conscious will. One was a blind young woman he called Salome. She represented feeling, the soul function, which he would later formally name the Anima. These were not hallucinations. They were, he argued, evidence of an autonomous intelligence operating below the surface of the ego. The Anima was the inner figure, autonomous and distinct from the ego, who carried the perceptive and feeling functions that the conscious mind had pushed below the surface. She was not a fantasy, she was not a symptom, she was, Jung argued, a structural feature of the psyche. She had always been there. Before Jung named her, she had other names. The Greeks called her the Muse. The ones who inspired poets were not external supernatural beings, they were projections of this inner figure, the autonomous intelligence that arrives when the conscious mind becomes quiet enough to listen. Socrates spoke of his daemon, an inner voice that did not tell him what to do but told him with absolute clarity what he must not do. He trusted it above the logic of his own reasoning. He followed it to his death rather than betray it. The ancient world did not regard this inner voice as pathology. It regarded it as the highest form of knowing. In the medieval tradition, the same figure appeared under the name Sapientia, holy wisdom. The theological writers of the 12th century, Hildegard of Bingen among them, wrote of a feminine intelligence that spoke through vision and pattern, that could not be reasoned into being, but could be summoned by stillness. Hildegard reported receiving visions she called the shadow of the living light. She did not manufacture these perceptions. They arrived. She transcribed them. Her contemporaries called her prophetess. What she was describing was the experience of an inner intelligence operating independently of conscious will, carrying information the rational mind had not assembled through logic. In the Norse tradition, the Volur, the Norse seers, were figures who entered altered states to access a layer of knowing below the surface of the everyday. They were consulted before battles, before migrations, before major decisions that would shape the fate of entire communities. What they accessed was not considered supernatural in the modern dismissive sense. It was considered a form of perception, a capacity to read patterns beneath the visible. The vulva did not tell you what to decide. She told you what was already present in the situation that your ordinary attention had failed to register. What connects Socrates, Hildegard, and the Norse seer is not religion or culture, it is function. Each of them was acting as a translator between two registers of knowing. The ordinary visible world of cause and effect, reason and argument, on one side, and a deeper layer of pattern, feeling tone, and relational meaning on the other. This is the translation function that the Anima carries in Jungian psychology. She is the psyche's bridge between what can be said and what can only be felt as true. Here is what the tradition points toward, even if it has never quite said it plainly. He observed that individuals with a highly developed inferior feeling function, those whose dominant perceiving architecture runs on introverted intuition, tended to experience the Anima not as an occasional visitor, but as a permanent feature of their inner landscape. The Anima for these individuals did not wait to be consulted. She was always present, always offering perception. The challenge was not to awaken her. The challenge was to learn to carry her without being overwhelmed by her. You recognize this. You have always recognized this, because this is not the psychology of exceptional historical figures. This is the architecture you were born with. The Sigma INFJ is knee-dominant. Introverted intuition, as the primary cognitive function, is not merely a preference for abstraction. It is a specific form of perception. It reads below the surface of events, below the stated meaning of words, below the presented face of situations, and identifies the pattern that is organizing everything. This is not inference, it is not guesswork, it is a structural feature of how the nickel-dominant mind processes the world. What the ancients called the oracle, Jung understood as a specific cognitive architecture. The pattern is the same, only the language has changed. And here is what the tradition knew that the modern personality frameworks have failed to say clearly. The person built to carry introverted intuition at the dominant level is also the person who carries the anima most consciously, most completely, most unavoidably. The bridge between the two registers of knowing does not sit at the edge of your awareness. It is the center of how you think. You are not trained to perceive this way. You are not shaped by circumstance into this kind of sensitivity. You received it, the way you receive a structure of bone, before you had words for it, before anyone told you what it was. This is why the Sigma INFJ's perception so often arrives as complete, whole, already interpreted. You do not work through the logic of a situation and arrive at an answer. The answer is already present when you turn your attention to the question. What has already been assembled for you in the unconscious processing layer is delivered as a finished knowing. The anima is the psychological name for the function that assembles it. She works below the surface and hands the result upward. This knowing is not magic. It is nigh-dominant cognition operating at full capacity. It also explains something that the Sigma INFJ rarely fully resolves, the experience of knowing something you cannot defend, of holding a perception whose evidence you cannot produce because it did not arrive through the evidence-gathering process. The muse does not come with citations. Socrates' daemon did not produce a reasoned argument. Hildegard's visions did not include footnotes. The anima delivers what she delivers and trusts the carrier to know what to do with it. This is the double gift and the double burden. You receive perception of extraordinary depth. You receive it in a form that the world around you cannot always verify or accept. This is not a flaw in your perception. It is the nature of the function you are carrying. Jung was careful about one thing. He said the danger of the anima was not that she was false. It was that she could be misread. A person who did not know they were carrying her would attribute her promptings to emotion, to anxiety, to irrational feeling, and dismiss them. Or they would identify with her entirely, losing the boundary between the ego's perspective and the deeper intelligence, and find themselves overwhelmed, flooded by perceptions they had no framework for organizing. The Sigma INFJ knows both failures. The first is the early life pattern, the years spent dismissing the inner knowing because no one around you had the same instrument, and you had no language for what you were receiving. The second is what happens in acute stress or sustained isolation. The inner world floods forward, and the outer world becomes impossible to navigate. What the tradition offers, the lineage from the Norse seer to Hildegard to Jung's own clinical discovery, is not reassurance. It is instruction. The anima is not there to be silenced. She is not there to be surrendered to. She is there to be worked with. The vulva went into her trance, but she came back. Hildegard had her visions, but she also ran a monastery, managed correspondence, composed music, and maintained rigorous intellectual discipline. Socrates had his daemon, but he also argued in the agora, challenged sophists, and held his position under pressure. The carrying of the anima is not a passive state. It is a practice. It requires the capacity to enter the deeper register of knowing and to return, to translate, to hold what you have received without losing your footing in the world. The Sigma INFJ shadow work in this frame is not to become more feeling, not to become more social, not to adapt to a world that was not built for your cognitive architecture. It is to learn the discipline of the tradition you are actually part of, to trust the perception, to develop the capacity to return from the depth it takes you to find the language that allows you to carry what you know into the world without burning in the translation. The wound in this lineage is real. It is not metaphor. The women who carried this function in centuries when it was not safe to do so were not destroyed because they were weak. They were targeted because the perception they carried was accurate. The thinking that's always been most dangerous about the Anima bearer is not the irrationality of the perception, it's la precisione. Io not the first persona carriessa. Io am the casus feti cos that has survived every attempt the world has made to be rid of it. If this has landed somewhere it needed to land, then you may already know what comes next. There are 7 Sigma INFJ archetypes, and each one carries a different gift, a different burden, a different mythic responsibility. The link in the description will take you to a free assessment that reveals yours. It takes about 3 minutes. The answer tends to land harder than people expect. And if you want to keep walking these threads with me, into the deeper psychology of the Sigma INFJ, into the archetypes the world has forgotten how to name, subscribe. There are far older and stranger things still to uncover. Until next time. Find your power. Know your myth.